Y'all know what it is.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to another exciting episode of Eggs. This week we have very special guest, Aubrey Terrazas. Aubrey is a veteran hospitality professional, master sommelier candidate, and e-commerce entrepreneur. As co-founder of the digital wine service, Palate Club, she not only led the international wine buying for the team, but used her experience of tasting hundreds of wines each year to identify more than 200 wine traits, the core data that Palate Club uses to expertly match wines to your taste. Aubrey is also a wine educator and journalist that champions sustainability and up-and-coming regions for publications such as SommJournal and GuildSomm. Her ideas and disruption to the classic wine club model positioned her as one of America's top sommeliers and wine entrepreneurs. Here today for a conversation about wine and entrepreneurship, please join us in welcoming to the show the incredible Aubrey Terrazas. Hey Aubrey, how are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Doing well. Thanks so much for taking the time to do this show. I know, a little behind the scenes action. This one's been rebooked a handful of times, and, we really appreciate your patience and all that good stuff and trying to make this happen. Coordination, especially in the summer months, is just a nightmare. So thank you for your patience.
Yeah.
Glad to have you here.
Yeah, no problem.
Cool. So let's just start, I guess, a little bit at the beginning. Let's start with a little bit of background about who you are, where you come from, and what you do.
Yeah. So I started working in restaurants when I was 14, which eventually led to a career in hospitality. In college, I was waiting tables still, which eventually became a sommelier position, a love for wine. And then eventually, after working in restaurants for a very long time, for about 15 years, which was literally half my life at that point, I felt like I had the work ethic and desire to venture out on my own. So I started a wine marketing agency. And around that same time, this was early 2017, I met Nicola, who's the co-founder of Palate Club. And we launched that project using AI to match wines to your taste. So I've been involved in a couple different projects since then, but wine marketing, wine education, wine data science. And then I moved to France about a year and a half ago.
Okay. Well, no, that sounds awesome. Well, and maybe we can dig in a little bit more, just given that so much of your life circles around wine. Obviously wine is a big part of hospitality here in the States and especially in France where you're at now. But can we talk a little bit about just sort of what made that pivot happen? So, it was probably something to do with your position in the company back then, but were you always drawn to wine? Was this something that interested you from the jump? So it was an obvious transition?
Yeah, I loved wine I loved drinking from an early age. But eventually, when you do work at nicer restaurants, the thing is, because I started waiting tables when I was a kid, I was positioned to work at nicer restaurants than a lot of people in my age group. So I was, bartending at 19, working in fine dining at 19. Bartending was legal in Iowa at the time. But you learn a lot about wine because you have to be able to sell it and talk about it with guests. And I just found it so intriguing how I could combine my love for language and travel, history, culture, food, all into this subject. It's really, really endless. And it's also extremely social. It's something that brings people together. From someone that was really a restaurant professional when I was maybe 22, that's the first time that I worked with a sommelier. And I just saw him just like sipping wine and just romancing people all night. And I was like, I'd be great at that. And that just, is when I pivoted in my career.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Well, and I think it's really interesting too. Just this sort of path in hospitality. I think, some people are really cut out for it and other people aren't. Some people can really go on and build a career out of this thing because they love building relationships with people. They love sort of the relationships between food and drink and social interaction and things, all the things you're pointing to. And you mentioned Iowa early on. It doesn't seem like that's exactly wine country, but but nonetheless, you were running into or working in higher end restaurants, and that's how you were introduced.
Yeah, well, I'm from the Quad Cities, which maybe some of your listeners know where that is. Our claim to fame is that John Deere, the tractor, comes from Moline, Illinois. which is on the border there with Iowa. But I went to Chicago for college. I took a year off and I was working. So I was in Illinois, but it's just 5 minutes away from Iowa. So I was working in Iowa. But a lot of my professional career in fine dining has been between Chicago and San Francisco.
Okay. So, another thing that I'm noticing, I mean, obviously from the introduction and from a little bit of your background information, I mean, obviously there's an entrepreneurial spark in there too. The fact that you were working in restaurants at 14, screams sort of industrious, this makes me sort of a young industrious person entering the workforce at an early age. I have a son who's 14 and he just started his first job. And, so I kind of recognize some of those characteristics in him as well. But, so in your case, I mean, would you say that you were entrepreneurial to begin with, or was this sort of industriousness, this drive, is that what maybe led to an entrepreneurial opportunity?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. I think that coming from a blue collar community, I didn't really consider entrepreneurship, although I did have that spark from a young age. I would make crafts that I would sell to my parents' friends. I would always find a way to scrap together money. I would, like buy used Barbies at garage sales and then resell them at my garage sale, things like that. But I didn't necessarily consider it until I was a little bit older, into my late 20s. And it really, I think that when you are someone that's industrious and very hardworking, and you're also creative, those are all the makings of being a great entrepreneur. And so once I realized that I'm a really hard worker and that I'm great at management, I have a lot of ideas, I'm like, I could do this. And that's just when I made that change to work for myself.
I love that. Well, so I want to try and bridge this little gap too. You mentioned something about, sort of having a passion for language and travel and things like that. And it's funny, I mean, you're from Iowa. I understand that part of the country to some degree, right? I mean, I'm from Southeast Idaho, so same kind of blue collar, a little bit harder, part of the country, not maybe as, I don't know, white collar as you'd see in a San Francisco or something like that. And so it's sort of different culturally, but I know growing up for me, it wasn't until I was sort of out on my own and everything that sort of my passion for travel started to come out. We did a lot of travel locally and stuff, but the people I knew in Idaho weren't traveling, abroad or doing anything interesting like that. Was it your interest in wine and this sort of, I guess, wine culture that started to draw you into Europe and other places like that, these hot spots where wine is kind of the culture? Or were you already sort of drawn to travel before that, and this was just a way to sort of, I guess, connect the two pieces?
I think that they sort of blossomed simultaneously. Because I knew I was a French major, actually. And so that was before I had even ever left North America. But I knew that I wanted to work in wine and that France and French makes sense for a career in wine somehow. But I still didn't know what I was talking about, was when I was 20. So I went to study abroad when I was 21. And that's really when I got the travel bug. And I started from that point on, I would very frequently leave the country for 3 months at a time, where 2 weeks here, 3 months there, Asia, Europe, South America. And, I think that people that love travel also often do love food and wine, because you understand a culture so well when you really start to investigate and take the time to understand what they're eating and drinking.
Yeah. No, I think that's very true. And actually I can sort of, pile on your experience there. In my case, however, it's a passion for Spain. So I spent a lot of time in Spain. We have a small team, part of our company that's located in Barcelona or just around Barcelona. And so I too have started to fall into wine and food and, Spanish culture and all that sort of stuff too, which I just love, especially as an American. And if our upbringings are even somewhat similar, just being from sort of, rural America, that culture over there, and the French and the Spanish have a lot in common, even though they may not say that out loud, but I feel like I can say that. I think that for me, that culture, or the difference in culture, was such high contrast to the way that I grew up. that for me, it was wildly impactful. Visiting Spain the first time changed my whole life and the way that I think about everything. And I don't know if that's similar for your experience, but anyway, that was the case for me.
Yeah, I think that it's extremely important for people in a leadership position to travel, because you start to open your mind up to different ideas, different, how things are done differently. And even actually, when, for myself, especially when I moved abroad, when you remove yourself from all of the things that you identify yourself with, I'm from San Francisco and I'm a sommelier and these are my friends and this is where I live, this is who I am, and you're suddenly just this random person in a new place. You're really forced to confront your values and what's important to you. And I think that that's hard to do when you're around the same people and the same ideas over and over and over again, even if it is a more open-minded place like San Francisco or New York.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And I mean, for me too, a big part of it was, not only relationship with food and all that stuff, but the value, at least in Spanish culture, I presume this is the same in France, but they put such high value on people that the things that tie people together, the social experiences, foods, wines, things like that, the things that we all do together, the value that they put on that stuff, really hit me like a ton of bricks. Not to say that I didn't have great relationships or good family and all that stuff here in the States. It just, for me, it was a big, I guess, sort of shift in mindset and the way that things could be done. So I'm sort of like you, I'm very entrepreneurial. I have a couple of businesses of my own, that sort of thing. And in my head, I mean, I spent my whole 20s sort of head down, just hammering away, being, I guess, as uber American as I could be, right? Just, working 20-hour days, trying to make all the money, all that stuff. And then after going to Spain and finding out that, nobody's impressed by your ability to make a ton of money and nobody gives a rip if you work a 40-hour, 50-hour week or whatever, like nobody cares about that. Right. That's not currency to them. I show up, I remember one meal in particular, I showed up wearing a really nice watch, and I was all proud of my new cool watch, and trying to show it to the guys and stuff. And they're like, yeah, we're talking. Nobody cares about my cool watch. What's going on? In the States, everyone would love my cool watch. So what are we talking about? So it was kind of an eye opener for me, but it's changed the way we do business, everything. I think it's very important to travel and, for people who maybe haven't been exposed to other cultures like that, I think it's really important to get out and see those things.
Yeah. I mean, I think the biggest thing from a culture like that is that you realize that work is not the most important thing in the world.
Yeah. Yeah. It's live to work, not work to live, or no, the other way around. Yeah. It work to live.
Yeah. You work to live, not live to work. Yeah. And that was a big shift for me too, especially once I moved abroad. They do still value success. And, I know plenty of French people that are very hardworking when they need to be. But at the end of the day, like, they're still going to put their family first. They're still going to take time to have a lunch with a friend. And that's what it's about, because there's no point in just working all the time just to have this money and have these things. I'd much rather have experiences and people in my life.
I agree. Well, cool. So let's take another step further in your trajectory here. Let's talk a little bit about wine some more, because I'm very interested. What was the most surprising thing you learned about the wine industry as soon as you started getting in there? Besides the sort of superficial, I'm working in a restaurant selling wine, when you actually started to understand a little bit of the industry, I mean, was there anything interesting or insightful that you sort of uncovered or maybe didn't realize about the wine business?
Sure. Yeah. I think the biggest thing is that people really, really romanticize it. And they don't realize how hard it is to, well, first of all, even when I do have days where I taste wine all day, but let me tell you, it is work. It is, going to the vineyards, like, you leave at 7 a.m, you drive an hour to the vineyard, you start tasting at 9, like, you don't have lunch, or like, you're just like eating baguette and cheese, getting around, tasting 5 wineries, go back at 7, then you still have all of your other work to do. So I think that's just the biggest thing, is that, in any career, whether I love what I do, but even a passion-driven career, there's a lot of work, and you're not tasting wine all day, every day. There's, you're on a computer, you're on Zoom calls, just like everybody else.
Yeah. Well, and I imagine that was probably a big transition for you. I mean, as a young person working in restaurants, the vision was probably, oh God, look at all the fun those sommeliers are having. They just get to get hammered every afternoon and it's a great time. They're hanging out with their friends and drinking wine. But yeah, I guess when the business piece of it comes around, it makes, I guess all of a sudden reality sets in, right?
Yeah, well, in working from restaurants, I always knew that there's a lot of hard work that just comes with the territory. When you're working at Michelin-starred restaurants, you're working 12-hour days, you're working till 2 a.m. That was no surprise to me. But it is more appealing when you're in your early 20s. And then, as I got even just a little bit older and when I was married and everything, I was like, it is fun to work in restaurants. It's fun to work in wine, but also getting back to what we were talking about earlier, finding that balance in your life where maybe I do want to go home for the holidays sometimes, and maybe I want more than 4 days vacation a year. And drinking wine is great, and that's part of the job, but finding a path that allows you a little bit more freedom and balance.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's where it's at, right? I mean, just to sort of circle back around to this idea of sort of, building great relationships and doing so with food and wine and culture and all that stuff. I imagine as a person working in that industry, it can be somewhat liberating. You can find your freedom. Like you mentioned, it's a passion, so you're working in your passion, which is always a beautiful thing. But at the same time, the relationships you're building, the, flexibility to come and go, all those things, all the things that everybody looks for in sort of an entrepreneurial pursuit, I think could be found in wine. So
I just to add to that, I think that's something else that was I had to discover for myself. I'm sure it's true for many industries, but for example, with wine, especially for people that have worked in maybe a restaurant, a more traditional path, is you're kind of taught like these are the three things you can do. You can be a wine buyer at a restaurant, or you can work at a winery, be a winemaker, or you can be a sales rep. And then we're all taught that, the end game is basically to be a master sommelier and be a buyer for a distributor or something like that. And, when those don't always match exactly what you're pursuing, I think that it's true for a lot of entrepreneurs, like they see a different path. And even within something like wine, there are so many possibilities, and all of those relationships that you're building as a somm, for example, where you're talking to people that love wine all day, those can really play into the ideas that you might have.
Yeah, I love that. Another thing I think is interesting about the industry, and I don't know if you have been exposed to this or have any experience with it, but I saw a documentary or kind of a documentary on Netflix called Rotten, and they had an episode, I think it's called Reign of Terror or something like that. That has to do with sort of the French wine industry being bombarded with sort of, cheap knockoffs and things like this that are coming in and sort of, I guess, reducing the value of great French wine. Obviously wine is a big part of France culturally. And I imagine they get a little bit protective of this. I mean, have you experienced any of that or seen any of that in the work you're doing?
Yeah, it definitely exists. You see it a lot more in China. Is actually a huge, they in general have, even for something like a made on, as seen on TV product, there's so many knockoffs there, and it's true for the wine industry as well. But there's another documentary called Sour Grapes, where this guy just had an incredible palate, and he was able to fool all of these collectors by creating, perfect replicas of specific vintages of first growth Bordeaux, Burgundy. And I've worked in restaurants that actually even had some of his wines. They were purchased from private collectors. So that did directly, kind of influence me in some way. So it reaches there. And I think that's the thing is, wine is, once you get into the collector's realm, so much of it, unfortunately, never even gets drunk. Like it just gets passed around to different sellers. And I think a lot of times people don't even really care what's in it. They just want that label. It's almost just, it's like a piece of art, except no one really ever sees it. They just pull it out and say like, oh, look at this 1947, like Lafite Rothschild that I have. Isn't that cool? It's kind of silly because you're not even drinking it.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I mean, the way that you framed it, like as a piece of art, I think is a really good analogy for it, because I mean, it is that, right? It's people who can afford it pulling this stuff out to kind of show it off. But that's sort of the extent of it, when so much about wine and wine culture is about enjoying the product and sharing it with each other and that sort of stuff. So it's funny because it seems almost, I don't know, contrary to what you would want from somebody who is actually a lover of wines.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, don't get me wrong, people that are collecting, obviously, if you're a wine collector, you probably love wine. But I do think that there's a certain point where this sort of collector status, one, it inflates the price of wine a lot for people that actually want to drink it and enjoy it, but maybe don't have the money to spend $600 on a bottle of wine. And it also does, to your point, sort of, once you start to put in all of these fake bottles into the market, I wouldn't say that it deflates the value of wine overall, but it doesn't deflate the fiscal value, but I think it deflates the actual like life value of enjoying a bottle of wine when it just becomes this product that's for showing off instead of for connecting with people and enjoying and appreciating.
Yeah. You mentioned, so talking about the guy in the Sour Grapes documentary, not to draw too close of relationship there, I just wanted to point out that you mentioned that he had developed an extremely good palate. And I wondered if we could talk about that a little bit, what it means to develop a palate in wine. So I like I mentioned, I'm a big fan of wine. I mostly got introduced to it in Spain. So I drink tons of Spanish reds. Those are usually what I drink. And but like I don't know a good one from a bad one. I know what I like or don't like, but I don't know like what makes a good wine, what makes a bad wine. So I wonder if there's anything you could point to, just understanding that you have got sort of a refined palate. If there's something that we, common folk who like to drink wine should know about the wine we're drinking.
Yeah, I always say that the most important thing is that you like it. And I think for a fine bottle of wine, people don't give themselves enough credit because you instinctively want to slow down a little bit when you're drinking really good wine. Whereas normally if it's just sort of cheap and cheerful, you're just going to gulp it down, not think too much about it. But the things that make you slow down are the things that make a good wine, such as complexity, like how many different aromas are on the nose and the palate. Even the texture might be a lot more complex. So instead of just being this like one note sort of gulpable juice type wine, instead it might be like sort of silky or coarse or dusty. Also the balance. So even if a wine, for example, like I think a great example is Nebbiolo, a Barolo from Piedmont in Italy, is very, very tannic and very high acid and high alcohol. And you do feel that it's kind of strong on the palate, but you don't notice one element necessarily a lot more than the other. They're all sort of in balance with each other. And for me, also purity of fruit. Like I that's a personal preference maybe for me, but I like it when when it's not, when it's not flawed, basically, when it doesn't taste, when it's not overly ripe or you're not tasting this sort of like barnyardy feel, Brett to Tannemyces, so it has like a Band-Aid sort of smell to it. And that's a really common flaw that people overlook.
Okay.
VA.
Yeah, no, I think that's really useful information. I wonder too, can you talk about, or I mean, I don't know if this is your realm or not, so I don't know if you can say anything about it or not.
We'll try it.
But I have heard that part of the hangover that comes from drinking wine, at least here in the States, has to do with the sulfites. And I wonder if you know anything about sulfites, what they are, why we have them, and if it's actually better to not have them or not.
Okay, so that is a very hot topic in the wine industry, but I can tell you that sulfites are not causing your headache. That's a very common misconception because sulfites are a naturally occurring product from fermentation, and there are like 10 times more sulfites in dried fruit than there are in wine. So usually, however, some wine that some wineries that maybe are trying to cover up flaws or mass production might pump a lot more sulfites into it. If someone has a sulfite allergy, they're definitely going to know by a doctor, like you'll like break out like an allergy. But it's actually a natural product, and most fine wines put a very small amount in it. And the reason for it is because it stabilizes the wine. Because wine is otherwise a living product, right? And so it will have these ups and downs, just like, you wake up on the wrong side of the bed someday. Sometimes your wine's going to wake up on the wrong side of the bed, and it's going to have a lot of those sort of like junky flaws that I just mentioned, it will smell like mouse and just kind of lose all of its fruit and terroir. So I do enjoy some non-sulfite wines. I'm not saying that that doesn't exist, but a lot of times it will just come from drinking maybe wine that isn't as good and has like other additives in it besides sulfur that aren't required to be listed, or just drinking too much.
Okay, well, I know for a little while here on the market there was, and I presume it's still available, but I bought a wine filter sort of device. I can't remember what it's called, but basically you pour your wine through it and it runs it through like a carbon filter, and it's supposed to aerate and filter or whatever out all these, I guess, impurities or whatever. And I just wonder, is it sort of a marketing gimmick, or is it something that actually, is worth doing? Are you actually doing damage to the wine by running it through something like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And honestly, a lot of it, these are choices that winemakers usually make. So a lot of winemakers in Burgundy, for example, might choose not to filter their wine because you're also taking away some of the characteristics. You're sort of making it more plastic in a sense. You know what I mean? It's an example that I sometimes give for wines like that is like a woman that's like technically beautiful, like a Kardashian, like she's like looks technically perfect, but there's still something missing. Right. So you can take away some of those characteristics. However, though, sometimes it does need it too. But I think it's, for me personally, it's better to let the winemaker make that decision, because there's usually not going to be anything. If you're drinking decent wine, like, 15 and above, in most cases, it's not going to have anything too weird. And if you're concerned, it's better just to look for something sustainable or organic, biodynamic, rather than using a filter at home.
Okay. Well, and that actually takes me into the next topic. I wanted to talk sustainability. I know that this is a topic that's near and dear to you. And, but I mean, I've honestly never put one thought to sustainable wine. Like, I don't even know what that means. Right. Like, so, I mean, I go to the store, I find my little Spanish reds or whatever, and then I move on. I don't put a lot of thought into what actually makes a sustainable wine. So do you mind sort of explaining what that means? And I guess how we would know the difference if we were to go buy some?
Yeah. Well, the reason why it's so hard is because there's not a clear definition on it. It's sort of an umbrella term that incorporates a lot of different things. And every region has its own sort of classification. Like there's like Napa green, there's SIP. It's different in South Africa than it is in France, than it is in California. But overall, it means that people are making wine in a way that respects the environment. So that starts in the vineyard, obviously not using chemicals, choosing maybe to use other methods, like you could creating biodiversity in the vineyard by having like chickens eat the pests instead of using a spray, as an example. And that can also go back into the winery itself by reducing water waste, choosing lighter packaging, which will have a lower carbon footprint. So there's not an exact definition for it. And because there's not an exact definition, you can look to see if it has any of the sustainable certifications. Yeah, otherwise there's not, you just kind of have to do your research. If it doesn't say it on the bottle, then you can look into it. If it doesn't say something, then it usually isn't. But you can always, if it's a good retail shop or sommelier, they'll usually know as well. Because sometimes it will be like 95% sustainable, but technically they're converting to organics. They can't put it yet. Or maybe they spray once in every 10 years because it's just a really humid place, like Alsace. It's super, super hard to do organic. And there's a lot of gray area. That's something actually we're trying to fix with Palate Club too, is as wine buyers, we usually know more. And adding a filter where you can filter by sustainable wines, even if it's not, certified organic, then there's basically been a professional that said like, okay, they have sustainable practices.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think that helps put, at least put a little clarity around the situation, just in that it's the sort of thing that I think it's like organic in the grocery store or whatever, right? It's difficult to really know what that means because it could be a lot of things, right? It could mean no pesticides, could mean grown in a sustainable way, could mean all kinds of things. So I think that's useful to hear that about wine as well. Are there any markers or anything like that we should see, or are there brands in particular that pride themselves on this kind of thing we should be aware of?
I mean, like I said, there are a lot of different certifications. So if on the back label, it might say that they're XYZ sustainable or organic. A lot of times they can't, so they have to use a very, very small amount of sulfur to be considered organic. So a lot of times you'll see made with organic grapes. But one rather big brand that does a really good job is Fetzer. They have quite a few different labels, and they're also a B Corp, which I think is really impressive for a winery. It's not just in the vineyards, it's also like they have really great social impact as well, like providing language courses for their English as a second language employees and just fair wages, diversity. So I think that they're a brand to watch for. That you can find in most states too.
Very cool. I had just one more wine-centric issue, and then I'll stop beating your head with this thing.
No, I love it.
I wanted to talk a little bit more about palate and just how a person, an individual, anybody who's maybe not doing this professionally can start to develop a taste. You mentioned earlier that, the secret to wine is drinking the wine you like, but like, are there terms, are there tricks, are there things that we could employ that might sort of help us, I guess, better understand what it is we like, so that when we're in the store looking up and down the aisles, we can pick wines that actually cater to our tastes?
Yeah. Of course, like with Palate Club, that's something that we really encourage for people, just to rate wines based on how they like it. And then it gives them a profile that says, this is what you like. You like wines that are acidic, high tannin, red fruit. And so you can start to kind of learn that language and build it. Without a tool like that, I would say just, take, maybe just do a couple of different wine tastings. So when you go to a winery, just ask them how to walk you through the steps, and they should usually be knowledgeable enough to at least give you a system for tasting it. Because you're just looking for a few different things every time. And once you just know the pattern to look for it, then you can start to really develop that and pause and be like, okay, what does tannin feel like? What does sweetness feel like? And other than that, you smell stuff. I'm the weirdo at the farmer's market, the smelling, strawberries and cinnamon and everything. Or at least before COVID, I was putting my nose on everything. So just, taking a moment to just remember what black tea smells like will really help you with wine tasting too.
Okay. No, I love that. That's great advice. So let's take a little pivot into sort of the more entrepreneurial or more business centric. Obviously you're in France now, which is and maybe this is a little stereotypical, but sort of a male dominant culture, in a male dominant industry, in a male dominant business. And so if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about just sort of the experience of getting into wine, and if there are any hurdles you've had to overcome, challenges, things that have been in the way of your advancement, or, how it is that you navigate these sort of, I guess, what would have been traditionally male dominated industries.
Yeah. There's an advantage to being a woman in some sense, because you're different, you stand out more, which can be great for an entrepreneur. Especially when I was younger, I definitely had to, it took me more to gain confidence with customers, with partners, with investors, whatever that might be. And so I had to be 10 times more confident, and I had to flip the traditional sort of pitch deck on its head. We're usually talk about the team last, but when I was a 30-year-old woman pitching to investors, I had to present my credibility in the beginning. Because otherwise they would see me, and it felt like when I was starting my somm career all over again, I'd go up to the table and people thought that I was a hostess. And then I had to then talk about back vintages of Bordeaux just to get them to trust me a little bit. So a lot of it is just the knowledge and the confidence. And I think also boundaries. Women have to be very strong with their boundaries, and let people know that you're there for business. Because I think that a lot of men have tried to take advantage of a situation where you need something, and they want to treat a meeting like a date, or they might just say something inappropriate. And even if it's not sexual, but also just putting you down, not trusting your ideas, or not taking you seriously. And so you have to be a little bit more vocal. And in the past, I had to be, I guess maybe I presented myself as too serious in the past, because I felt like I had to be. And then I had to get past that as well, because then people think that you're a cold be. So
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting thing. And you actually, I touched on you said the same word a couple times, which is this idea of trust. And I
mhm,
wonder, as I'm sitting here thinking, as I'm hearing your story and thinking about sort of just male dominant industries, I wonder how much of it is fear, actually. If people are, here comes this young woman, she knows her stuff, but me and all the 40-year-old dudes or 50-year-old dudes have been running this circuit for a while, right? This is kind of our thing. Like, do we trust this young woman, right? And so I wonder if sometimes what comes off as misogyny or some of these other things, not to say those don't exist too, but I wonder if often it's a trust thing, if we're just not sure you can rise up to the occasion. And that sort of then, I guess, puts the onus on women to try harder or do those things that then get perceived as being bitchy or whatever. And so I'm wondering if if that rings true conceptually. And because you mentioned you really had to go back and talk about some old vintages and things like that to sort of prove yourself. But I wonder if what you're doing is sort of having to prove yourself in a way that builds this bond of trust, right? Because I feel like male or female, whatever, regardless of who you are, if I wholly trust you to do the work, if I know you're going to come in and you're going to give good advice and you're going to be the person for the job, that dissuades my fear. And then now I'm not afraid of having this, this subordinate or this woman or this whatever come and do what, was prior, in a prior life perceived as the job of the old white guy. And so I wonder, if any of that rings sort of true to you. I mean, I don't want to diminish it, but I'm trying to explore this topic because I think a lot of times we attribute to malice what could just be attributed to stupidity, or maybe, to be more polite about it, fear. And so I wonder if that sounds at all true.
yeah. But so I actually do feel like a lot of times it was fear and lack of trust, but I also do feel like that is the definition of sexism. It's assuming that someone can't do something because of their gender, and maybe some part because of my age. And so, yeah, absolutely. I felt as a woman, I always had to prove myself twice over. I felt like a lot of times I could see male counterparts, they would get away with BSing a lot more, the wine thing is an easy example. Like you see like a waiter with a French accent, just he can say whatever he wants about wine and people are just going to believe it.
Sure.
Whereas I actually knew about wine and I had to really convince them, even though I was the one that was in the somm role. So that's an easy example. Obviously, it gets more serious when you get into entrepreneurship and business. And it's unfortunate that that's what it is. But at the same time, I feel like it made me grow a lot faster than a lot of men starting out on the entrepreneurial journey would have, because I had to study more. I had to be more confident. And I did have to get past my own, external shell, because like I said, I was maybe colder in the beginning because people were calling me a girl. And so I, had to seem more serious and put on that facade until I got comfortable in the role myself.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I obviously I can't totally relate to the life of a female entrepreneur. So it's really important to hear your story and understand how you deal with these things. Like I say, I try to, take the perspective that most people aren't trying to hurt people, but I know that often they are, and in other cases they, it might just be doing something stupid. And so I think it's useful to hear sort of, the experience, and maybe it makes sense to shift into that entrepreneurial conversation a little bit and talk a little bit more. You mentioned about having to pitch to investors and things like that. And I mean, even in my own head, I can envision some stereotypes where, young, pretty girl shows up in the room versus established gray salt and pepper guy. Right. And immediately your impulse is, oh, well, this guy must know more, just like the guy with the French accent. Immediately, he must know more. He's French, and so I think that there's a lot more going on even than just the gender stuff, but there's absolutely no doubt that gender plays a very specific role in that stuff. So I wonder if you'd talk a little bit about just sort of your experience going into these, I guess, what would be considered high power meetings, right? These are the meetings that were traditionally, reserved for, the top men in an organization. And, you're stepping in and you're working in an industry that has been dominated by men entirely, and then trying to, I guess, sort of win them over. And I guess it's worked out to some extent. I mean, if you're still in business, I guess they've worked out. So I wonder if you can talk about, just sort of that experience, what it was like, and then, if there's some learnings you took from it, or if you're in some way better for having had to suffer that way.
Yeah. I mean, kind of what I was alluding to before, I just felt like I had to be that much more prepared. So that way, when you are in a position, like for example, being a young female entrepreneur, you already are aware of the biases that are probably happening in front of your audience's minds, or within your audience's heads. And so I had to, so it kind of works backwards because you're starting to get in your own head about what they're probably thinking about you and overthinking what their facial expressions might be. And so I did feel like I had to be that much more prepared every time and really have my script down and my presentation down. And so, that did make me stronger. And ultimately, if someone is not going to listen to the presentation when I'm well prepared, when my facts are gathered, when I have a good good reason to trust me, if they're still going to let their own bias get in the way, then that's not really a partner that I want to work with anyway.
Yeah, no, I think that's a super, astute finding, or that's a great place to land because, I have a number of experiences where I've been to these business conferences and stuff. And I always point to one specifically. I went to a U.S. National Hispanic Chamber of Commerce event. We do a lot of work back and forth in Spain. And so we'd worked with the U.S. Hispanic Chamber of Commerce a bunch of times. And they invited us out to their conference in Miami. And I remember sitting in this room, full of, Hispanic and South American entrepreneurs, and listening to them, have this man speak to them about how everybody's kind of out to get them, and they need to step on the neck of the competition and take from them what's rightfully theirs and stuff. And I remember just being so grossed out by this idea, because my whole thing is if this company doesn't want to work to you because their biases are in the way, well, then you don't want to work with them anyway. You're not going to convince them. You're not going to make the racist all of a sudden not racist. You're not going to make the sexist all of a sudden not sexist. So I mean, this idea that you're going to be able to come in and force your will, no, I mean, even if they took your contract, it's going to be kind of a yucky deal all the time. You're always going to wonder, so I think your perspective that, understanding that their biases are in the way, good or bad, whatever, it is what it is, and being able to sort of hold your head high, knowing that you did the work and that you did your part, understanding that you can't change everybody, I think is a really good way of approaching it, because I think the alternative is to sit around and stew on it and be upset that nobody's, listening to you and feeling, really disempowered.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's never good to waste time on people that aren't going to be your customers, investors, whatever it might be anyway. You can put that energy into people that care. And then once you're successful, then you'll go back and change those people's minds, but then you can flip them the finger because they didn't work with you when they had the opportunity.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think the other thing I'm taking from your story, and don't let me put words in your mouth, but I think that it's also, because of the struggle, you're ultimately better now at your job than you might have been otherwise. If you could have just coasted through and been sort of, green lit all the way through from start to finish, you probably wouldn't be as strong or as qualified or as knowledgeable as you are today. And so I think that there's, it's a little bit of a shift in attitude, because obviously everybody wants to not have to deal with the struggle. But I think sometimes those who have endured the struggle, whether it's gender, race, financial, whatever, I mean, there's lots of reasons people don't have a clear path. I think being able to sort of take some solace in that the journey is really a big part of it, right? And ultimately you end up being a better performer because of it. I say this to my son all the time that, because he's a straight A student and he works his butt off, but he's got all these friends of his that, sort of slough school and don't show up and don't work hard and stuff. And I always joke, I mean, it's a little crude, but I always joke that, well, those are the people that are going to work for you one day, right? Those are the people that are going to have to, clean up around the office because they're not qualified to do the job you're doing. And I think that is a way, at least, of sort of framing the journey that we go through, or framing our own individual challenges, whatever they may be. And I guess sort of taking ownership of them and understanding that, yes, it's hard now, but I'll actually be better for it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not helpful for anyone to sit around and, cross your arms and be upset that the world is the way it is. I mean, I think that the Me Too movement brought a lot of awareness to power dynamics with women. But now we're at the point now that's been around, and we should really focus on solutions and just keep pushing forward. And I wouldn't really change anything.
Yeah.
Like I'm happy that I was forced to be as strong as I was.
Yeah. And I don't know if it, I mean, it's just sort of my attitude too, but I think that there's so much to personal responsibility, right? Understanding that, you're presented with whatever you're presented with, and some folks have it easier than others. And some people have to do things maybe they're not proud of, or maybe should or shouldn't do, but, nonetheless, we be responsible for our decisions, right? So you decided to fight through misogyny and whatever else stereotypes so that you could sort of excel in this industry that was male dominated. And but that was your decision. You could have easily been turned off early on and said, okay, this isn't for me, I'm just going to go do whatever's easiest. So I think it's good to sort of tip a cap or sort of give a high five to the people who have also suffered and who have worked through stuff, because I think it's really important to sort of acknowledge the effort.
Yeah, I mean, we all have our own personal journey, and just because it might not be, I mean, even for someone that comes from an affluent white family and they're a dude with everything handed to them, they still have their own struggles. We don't know what they look like, and we're only responsible for our own story.
Yeah, no, I love that. Well, so let's talk a little bit about your marketing business. So you've got a company that does a lot of sort of social media and pay-per-click and SEO work, all this kind of marketing work in and around the food and hospitality industry, but with a little bit of a focus on wine. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about sort of making this old industry new again.
Marketing or wine?
Well, I guess marketing wine.
Yeah. So the wine marketing is very interesting because it is such a people business. And so a lot of, especially when you look at small winemakers now in Europe, a lot of them are very distrusting of new technology. They're like, what is Instagram? And it's like, okay, man, it's 2021. You should probably at least have an Instagram account. And so I think that a lot of these channels they're starting to open up and find purpose in the wine industry, but it's also about knowing your industry and knowing what's working. And for a long time for wine, that's been events, because it is an experience. You kind of need to taste the wine. No one's going to buy a bottle from a winery without tasting it just because they see a Facebook ad. And so finding out how to use these tools and in an industry like wine that's like so unique and so experiential, and also learning how to adapt the old practices like events into a more modern setting. I think that if there's one good thing that came from COVID, it's the acceleration of those ideas and e-commerce. And so, for example, events for a long time, wine was all about wine salons. Everyone would go to Dusseldorf and meet people, and they'd have to pay for this booth. It was really expensive. Everyone was there. It's great for networking and drinking and everything. But now a winemaker in France can ship wine to several exporters in the United States and host a digital event. And it saves everyone a lot of time and money to be able to find new wines in that way and connect digitally. So I think that people are starting to sort of adapt these modern techniques into really traditional practices that work for the wine industry, and also starting to learn how, a social presence and a nice website can actually really convert and bring in new customers too.
Yeah, no, I love that balance there that you're trying to strike between sort of the old and new. I don't work in the wine business, but a lot of the companies that employ our agency, we do marketing and things like that as well. We actually have a ton in common, you and I. We should be buds. But a lot of our clients are in the healthcare industry, which is sort of an antiquated business. And, they're still sending out direct mail and doing things in sort of what we would consider an old way, advertising in the newspaper, things like that. And so it's really interesting, this sort of bridging of old technology and new technology, and sort of, the way that you communicate with people, especially, in different audiences and as they grow. I mean, I imagine there's probably not a ton of marketing effort in the wine industry being sent at 18 to 19-year-olds I guess maybe 21 here in the States. But like young people probably aren't as big a target as maybe your sort of, middle generation, your 40s, 50s, 60s type people. And so, but how do you speak to them? Right. I mean, maybe they don't spend any time on Instagram. Maybe you don't, so it's right to sort of balance all this stuff out and figure out, who it is you're speaking to and how best to reach them.
Yeah. I mean, I think just like with wine, you just have to know your audience and your industry and the brand message. What works for one winery, one wine brand might not work for another. So it's good to just, I think that there's a lot of times with marketing, you either are specialized in a niche or you're specialized in a specific skill set. Some people, it's just Google ads and that's all they do. And that's great. But if you're in like healthcare, wine, you have to kind of be a generalist and be able to sort of adapt to the situation of that brand.
Yeah, no, and actually that's a really good point too. And maybe we can elaborate it on a little more here. But the idea that, I don't know if you have a lot of experience in working in sort of a generalist agency, for example. I mean, because you came from sort of a niched world anyway. But but even though you're in sort of this niche market of hospitality, wine, these sorts of things, I imagine there are really, really, really tight niches in there too that you could get into. Only high tannin red wines or something, and you just market for those. I don't know that, but what I'm wondering is, or what I wanted you to sort of comment on is sort of the, I guess, the value in, they say the riches are in the niches, or the niches in France, but that's where the money is in niching down. And I wonder if you had any thoughts, or if you have any experience to the opposite that you might be able to make a case for niching.
A case against niching? Is that what you mean?
No, for niching down.
Oh, for niching. Yeah. Okay.
I think especially with agencies, most people are afraid to take that step, and you sort of seem to have started in that realm already. But I have some experience.
No, I can speak to it because I started in a niche, and in part because a lot of my marketing experience had been very sort of grassroots, being sort of like a restaurant manager. And my co-founder of the agency in California and I really were able to adapt and grow very quickly within our niche. And then when I moved to France, I sold my partnership February 2020. So I was starting a new agency in a foreign country on the heels of COVID. It was it was terrifying. Yeah, it was terrifying. And so at that point, I was like, well, oh my gosh, like, especially in France where it is very, face-to-face sort of interaction, I felt like I needed to expand. And so I was very hesitant to focus on the wine niche again, because I didn't feel like people would find, I thought that, the wine industry would be too afraid to invest in marketing at that point. And I think that I lost a lot of time that way. Because once I started getting back in and focusing on wine, the leads started to come to me much more easily. People do trust you when you understand their business. And of course, like, I've worked as a wine buyer, I've worked in retail, I've worked in import export. Like, I really, really understand that industry. And so I can understand the specific needs to almost any business within that. And I wish that I had just stuck with my guns and, it's even slowed down my personal brand so much. It confused the Instagram algorithm. Like, it was just, but it is scary. It is really scary to focus.
Yeah, no,
you feel like you're missing customers, but I think it's the opposite.
Yeah, no, I think that right there is maybe makes the whole show worthwhile for anybody who's sort of young and entrepreneurial and thinking about getting into the business, marketing, or really any type of small business. I think there's a great argument to be made for niching down. And even though it's so scary, if you really sort of take into account the scale of the world, there's plenty to go around. So feel free to niche into whatever it is you love. So I wondered too, just as we're talking sort of entrepreneurial, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the Palate Club, just real briefly, as we're getting to the end of the show here. I wondered if you could sort of talk about sort of, I guess, first of all, the creation of that business, sort of the niche you saw or the need you were trying to address with that business, any challenges along the way, and sort of, what the future of a business like that looks like.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it was created out of this really need to disrupt the way that we buy wine, because it's just so confusing, and it's very fragmented. I think it's very hard for customers to understand. You even asked earlier, like, how do you know what you're going to like? You go to a wine shop and there are hundreds of labels, and wine industry has not fully caught up to e-commerce and buying online. In part because, if it's already confusing to go to your local wine shop, imagine going online where there's even more wine labels and can't have a conversation with someone. And so just being able to find good wines that are sustainable, sommelier selected, and matched to your taste. It gives you that confidence to be able to discover new wines without having to spend, $20, $30 every time and have that risk. And I mean, when you just drink one thing all the time because you like it, you're missing on so much fun of discovery in the wine world.
Yeah, and I was going to say, just to that point, one thing I think is really cool that you guys do is this idea of blind tasting. So the bottles are wrapped and you can't see the label right away. And the idea, I guess, is that we're sort of testing the algorithm, right? We're testing the AI. Are you able to send us the bottle we like without the preconceived notion of, oh, I always like brands from this region, or I always like brands from this, or I always like wine from this brand or whatever. So I think that's a really unique approach as well.
Yeah, I think that we all have, just like we were talking about when I walk into a room full of investors, they all have their ideas about who I am before I even speak. It's the same thing with a bottle of wine. You already think, for example, people all the time tell me they hate Riesling, they don't like sweet wine, but that's always one of our best performing white wines because, like people think that they're supposed to like something or not. And so when you take away the label, the design, and the other information like the grape, the region, it's really surprising what you actually love. And that's the whole point of wine, is just to be able to enjoy something you like with friends. So
I love that. Well, cool. So here, sort of at the end of the show, I wonder if you just sort of let people know where they can find out more about you, the things you're doing, learn more about the work you do, not only in your agency, but also, at Palate Club, or just sort of in general. You mentioned a personal brand that you're working on. I don't know if you want to talk about any of that, or just sort of point people to where they can go look.
Sure. Yeah. So palateclub.com, it's spelled PALATECLUB.com. So palate like your mouth, not like a paint set. My personal Instagram is Aubrey Pops Bottles. You can find me on LinkedIn at Aubrey Terrazas. I think I'm actually the only one. So.
Perfect. And we'll be sure to share links and everything in here too. So, or in the show notes, we'll include all those links and everything, so people will be able to track you down. So cool. Well, thank you so much, Aubrey. This has been awesome. I really appreciate you making the time to make this happen, and apologies, retroactively for all the reshuffling and all that good stuff.
No worries. Yeah, it's summer. We're all traveling. I'm not even in France right now, actually. So.
Oh.
I just flew over the weekend.
Yeah, they opened that place up, so I'm trying to get out there as quick as I can. I'm supposed to be coming in September back to Spain anyway, and I'll be over there for about a month. But I just got notice today that the conference I was attending got pushed back again to now late October. So I don't know. So maybe I'll get there before I don't know. So anyway, well, thank you so much, Aubrey. I really appreciate you being here. And thanks to everybody who tunes in this week and every week. And we'll see y'all next time.